Hello, and welcome to this evening's presentation. I'm Diane Okonski, and I'm very happy you're able to join us this evening. We've got a couple of things I want to talk about before we get started with our program. The first one is that the INLUS has a new member drive underway. New members who join before February 28th will be entered into a drawing for an autographed copy of Nancy Marie Brown's latest book, Looking for the Hidden Folk: How Iceland's Elves Can Save the Earth. Also, a separate drawing will be held for those who give a gift membership prior to February 28th. So that's a month away. Don't let time fly by. You can just click on the join button at inlus.org and get yourself signed up. Another thing I want to let you know about is that the INLUS will likely offer another round of our very popular Icelandic language classes early this spring. We will have more information forthcoming in our next INLUS newsletter and online. The newsletter will be available right around the 1st of March. So stay tuned and we'll make sure we get the information out to you. So now for our standard reminders. This program is being recorded and will be available on the INLUS website within the next day or so. Also, as attendees to the program, you are on mute. However, we do want to hear your questions and comments. So please use the Q&A button to open up a text box so you can type in your questions and comments, and we will get to as many of those as we can during the course of our program. So I think that's enough for the announcements for now. So let's get on with tonight's program. And I want to introduce our guest. Anthropologist and writer Margaret Willson has traveled extensively in Brazil, Papua New Guinea, Mongolia, Australia, Europe, and Iceland. Her eclectic, non-academic jobs have included abalone diving and being a deckhand on fishing boats off the south coast of Tasmania. She received her PhD in anthropology from the London School of Economics and is currently an affiliate associate professor with the Departments of Anthropology and Scandinavian Studies at the University of Washington, and is a senior associate scientist at the Stephenson Arctic Institute in Iceland. In 2016, she published her first book on Iceland, Sea Women of Iceland: Survival on the Edge. While she was researching that, she learned about Þórður Einarsdóttir, and that was the first person that Margaret met, and she was just hooked. First writing about Icelandic sea women in general, and now finally an entire book on Þórður. This book, titled Woman, Captain, Rebel: The Extraordinary True Story of a Daring Icelandic Sea Captain, came out today. Links to both of her books, The Sea Women of Iceland and Woman, Captain, Rebel, can be found on the inlus.org website in the Books and Authors tab under Travel and Culture. Margaret, we're thrilled to have you with us this evening and so happy to be part of your book launch. This is really great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Before we get into the book actually takes place in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Can you describe what fishing and fishing boats were like at that time?
Difficult. I mean, it was hard work. That's what I'll say right away. It was really tough. They were open rowboats. So I have well, we have the first slide. Could we have the first slide, Doug? Yeah, go to the next one. That's the book, by the way. That's the cover of the book. That's nice to have, but go to the next slide. Yeah. So this is a particular audience here. Most of you have been to Iceland, have relationships to Iceland. So I don't need to explain to most of you, but we're talking near the Arctic, cold. And this is just north of Eyrarbakki in the south coast, which has almost no harbors. So fishing there was very difficult. This is the sea comes right onto the shore here, so people would not come here to this beach if they could ever help it. But could I have the next slide? So this is Thorlakshavn, which was about the only reasonable harbor along the south coast. It's been much enlarged. It's very much changed now. This picture is from about the 1890s, and this is on a really nice day, by the way. But this is what the boats, they didn't change that much. They started to get sails, but not until the latter part of the 1800s, and this one doesn't have one. But this is basically what it was like. They were open rowboats, and we're talking through snow. They fished mostly in the winter. So we're talking snow, sleet, and this is off the south coast of Iceland. You're on the North Atlantic. So there's nothing. So the waves that could come were just enormous. I mean, the description of them were horror, terrifying. And lots of people drowned. Also, nobody knew how to swim. Not that you would last too long in this, but they fished with single hand lines, and they often used lugworms, things they found on the beach, as bait. And they fished mostly for, well, they fished for a lot of stuff, but particularly cod was always wanted, the deep fish. And they just fill up the boat and row back in, basically. So, yeah, I would say that's a description of them. We could go on for a whole hour on it, but I think that's, just gives you an idea.
It sounds very cold and not a very enjoyable job. Were women fishermen or women fishers common at that time?
Well, this is where when I say that, I first became enticed with doing the research in Iceland, because I'd worked at sea myself, and people told me that there hadn't been women fishing in Iceland. And I was dubious, because if I could do it in Australia and other places, I thought, I just thought it was very strange. But what we found surprised with me, with my research assistants and colleagues, was astonishing. I mean, we found not just dozens, we found hundreds, even thousands of women, records in the history of women. And then I interviewed about 200 women who were fishing at the time that I did that book, which was about 2013, 14. But what I found, and also Þórunn Magnúsdóttir, she wrote about this in the 1980s as well, just in her BA thesis, but she found the same thing, that you could say, I can say confidently that a full third of the fishing fleet in Iceland in the 1800s was women. Let's go ahead and have the next slide. They were everything. There's one thing with Iceland, there's a lot of records, and they worked as crew, just regular deckhands. They also worked as helmsmen, and they were also skippers. And they were applauded for it. Now, this is a painting by Bjarni Jónsson, and it's a beautiful painting, but it's not accurate. Fair enough, it's gorgeous. But if you'll see, but the reason I show it is that it's supposed to be the mid 1700s. They didn't get sails for another 100 years, so that's incorrect. And also some other things. But he actually has a woman in it, which almost no other sort of historical rendition have women at all. But this woman is supposed to be Halldóra Oddsdóttir, who was in the mid 1700s one of the foremost captains of that time. Now, one thing, she wouldn't be wearing that, because like the men on the boat, she would be wearing an anorak, because you couldn't go out without a skin anorak and a hat, or else you'd die. But quite a few women wore skirts. Quite a few wore trousers as well at sea. That was acceptable, actually. But the other thing about Halldóra is she always took only female crew. She never took any men on her boats. And she had competitions constantly with her two brothers, who also had boats, And guess who always won? Sadly enough, there's only scattered information that we were ever able to find about her. For the first research, I think somebody else could find more if they went into the archives. And she fished mostly in Breiðafjörður, for those of you who know where that is, in the west. So there were a lot, yeah. It wasn't uncommon at all until about the early 1900s.
Right. So you heard of Thurther on your first trip to Iceland, as you said. So how did you meet her? And could you please introduce her to us?
Well, what I'd like to do, if it's okay with all of you, I will read a section from my book there. I have really bad eyesight for those of you who are watching, so I'm going to hold the paper pretty close to my eyes, but let me, also it's kind of dark in here. Okay, so I'm going to just talk about how I first encountered Thurður. Yeah. I learned of Captain Thurður through a chance trip to Iceland, for those of you who believe in chance. In the early 2000s, my Icelandic friend and Seattle housemate, Disa, was planning a short trip to her native Iceland. When she invited me to visit her there, I jumped at the chance. After all, when else was I going to get a chance to visit Iceland than not the big tourist place it is these days? After I arrived, Disa generously took me around to see the sights of her homeland. About an hour's drive east of Reykjavik, on a coast of pale yellow grasses that swept flat to a watercolor sky, we arrived at the rural oceanside community of Stokkseyri. So we can have the next slide. Since you're watching this, you get to see pictures, which nobody else will, of course. This is current day Stokkseyri, but the coast doesn't look much different. I mean, there have been volcanic eruptions and things like that, but basically, and there's also a big seawall, which there wasn't before. But this is basically what it looks like. Deceptively calm. I looked around at the scattered houses, the high stone wall between us and the sea. We wandered past a century-old wooden church encircled by a graveyard. Beyond it, as we walked along a street of houses, we stumbled across a rustic stone and sod hut surrounded by a low turf-covered wall. Can we have the next slide? You get to see it. This is in much better shape than it was when I first saw it, by the way. The hut appeared dilapidated. Memories once important, now forgotten. A cold wind cut through the bright sunlight, snaking between the buttons of our turned-up coat collars. Beside the hut, atop a weathered stone, lay a carved plaque dated 1949, only a few years after the end of World War II and Iceland's final independence, yeah? I opened the hut's unlocked wooden door, hanging loose on its hinges, bent my head to enter beneath the low crossbeam. Dark, dank, the only light from one tiny hole of a window. It felt like a cave. I crawled back out into the sunshine, and Disa was bending over the Icelandic inscription on the plaque. It's a reconstruction of a 19th century fishing hut of a celebrated fishing captain, she explained. I looked at the hovel. People lived here? Disa nodded. Seasonally, during the fishing seasons, they fished all winter. I imagined the mounded structure covered with snow, ice everywhere. So we have the next slide. This is later, and these huts, as you can see, are these fishing huts, as they call them, are nicer. This is, again, also by Bjarni Jónsson, who did a lot of great paintings of 19th century Iceland. And they have a loft. You can see they're nicer than the one that in Thurður's time, but it gives you an idea of what it was like when they were fishing in the winter. Disa gave me a quiet smile. Much of our history is not a gentle one, she said. She looked at the hut before us. The homes weren't much better than this. For many, the bodies of livestock who shared people's cramped quarters, provided the only heat they had. Her gray blue eyes took on a distant cast. These were her own ancestors she was talking about. Every winter brought a time to be endured, many cold, snow-covered springs, the threat of starvation. She looked away from me toward the distant mountains. Iceland, on the surface, appears very similar to other Nordic countries, but it is not. 600 years of oppression and poverty do not heal in mere lifetimes. It bleeds through in our literature, music, poetry, our perspectives of life, our relationships to our land. Her gaze now followed an oyster catcher flying above the sea wall. We are survivors, Margaret, harboring all the acquired insight, strength, and scars that name implies. I remained silent upon hearing this. Disa returned to reading the plaque. Of Captain Thurder, it says she lived from 1777 to 1863. I stopped my contemplation of the landscape. She, this fishing captain, was a woman? This is before I learned anything about Icelandic women in sea. Yes, Disa paused, scanning her childhood memory. My grandmother used to tell me stories about her. I had some trouble registering this. This female sea captain, about whom I had never heard a whisper, was celebrated enough that this community raised an historical commemoration in her honor almost 100 years after her death. This meant this community let her become a captain, more than let. Crews entrusted their lives to her, accepted her as their leader through these uncompromising Arctic waters. How would a society or intimate community react to a woman in this kind of role? How did she even manage it? Generally speaking, societies did not react well to women speaking their minds, attempting leadership roles. To see this, we only have to look at consider women accused of witchcraft or declared insane and committed to mental asylums for countering their husbands. Such rejection of female leadership holds even more at sea. Physical bravery, daring, these are traits accorded almost exclusively to men. So how did this woman become a sea captain? How was this possible? Was it even true? I looked over the pale blue Arctic Sea before me that seemingly stretched to infinity. I felt cheated. Why had none of us ever heard of Captain Thurder? Hauntings come in various guises. Trauma, lost love, remorse, troubling unanswered questions. For me, that haunting became Captain Thurder. So that's how I first encountered her.
Very interesting, very interesting. And Captain Thurder, as you mentioned, became quickly recognized as an exceptional person at sea. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And I think you have another reading that you were going to talk about and some of her daring adventures.
I do. And before I read that, I want to say something about why this book was even possible in the way it is. I was able to write it so that it reads almost like a novel, which you'll notice in this section I'm going to read. And that is because, as many of you will know, but Icelanders, as impoverished as they were obsessive writers, especially men were the writers. Women weren't taught so much to write, but everybody basically knew how to read. But in looking through, we looked through all these archives and combed the University National Library, and the National Archives. But what's so amazing is there's so much. And farmers they wrote about their neighbors. Everybody wrote about their neighbors. And Thurider stood out. So a lot of people wrote about her. But they didn't just write sort of, I don't know, just boring stuff. They have a flair. And so they recorded verbatim conversations. They recorded love trysts. They recorded betrayals. They recorded really snotty things, some which I haven't even put in the book because I figure their ancestors get really upset. But so for this section, for example, that I'm going to read, which is it's just a day at sea. It's something, well, you'll see what happens, but they're working at sea. And this is while she was a deckhand working for Captain Jan Thorðarson, who was called Jan Riki or Jan Rich, because phenomenally, nobody could understand how. He became very rich. Of course, later on, he partly became quite rich because Thurider was by then well known as being able to catch more fish than about anybody else. This is recorded by a lot of people. So for this section, you think about it, she wrote about it she did a handwritten autobiography for about 7 pages. One of her deckhands recorded it to somebody else. Then about the land, you'll see there's lots of details in the land. People wrote specifically about how you fished, where you came in, what the conditions were like. It's such tiny details about specific places that you can write it and texture it in, which I did. Also, we got really old maps, which actually showed the skerries and the reefs out from Stokkseyri and Eyrarbakki, the 2 places that really we focused on. So we were able to look at actually what they were like. And then, of course, local knowledge. I don't know how much longer this knowledge is going to be there, but some of the older people in Stokkseyri and Eyrarbakki area, they're scholars, and they know still exactly how everybody fished for 1,000 years. Well, I don't know about 1,000, but certainly 1800s. So, but I don't know, when they pass, I don't know if it'll be there anymore. So I feel very lucky. So that's why this is able to read as it does. Just to tell you, this is all from things that were recorded down. Okay. So this is just, they're going out fishing. So their captain, Jan Rich, soon arrived, and they dragged the boat across the rocks and into the water, joining 8 other boats on the open ocean. Thurider, as usual, surveyed the weather. Good, but unsettled, sure to change. Well, sure enough, a sudden strong wind soon sprang up. They pulled up their lines and rushed toward the nearby Eyrarbakki shore before the surf rose. Everyone else did the same. The skerries in Eyrarbakki lay in a parallel line out from shore, closed at one end but open to the sea at the other, creating a fairly deep but narrow single channel to the rocky beach. Boats coming from the east, as they all were that day, entered the passage through a narrow gap in the skerry line, requiring 2 tight turns hugged between skerries. Only one boat could enter at a time, the first one to arrive taking precedence, while the others waited their turn. As the waves got worse, as the waves rose, Jan Rich's boat skimmed over the water at speed, one of the first to arrive at the channel entry. Thurider took a note of the tide. Returning through the Eyrarbakki passage at an ebb tide was much more dangerous than a rising one. She nodded in satisfaction. Luckily, the tide was incoming. They pulled the boat from the water and paused to watch the other boats arrive. 6 made it swiftly to shore, but 2, clearly with weaker crews, lagged behind. Thurider glanced at her crewmates. Not good. Surf was mounting fast, now cresting over the outer line of skerries. The lead boat, which held 4 people, entered the narrow entrance, veered on the churning backwash, crashed into one of the outside skerries and became solidly wedged against the rocks. No matter how hard they pushed with their oars, the crew could not get it off. Violent surf now smashed the boat back and forth against the sharp lava. They'd break up in no time. As Þuríður and everyone else watched, the second boat, close behind them, intentionally veered its own course directly toward the skerry. At great risk to themselves, they would try to save the stranded men. This was going to be tricky. Any overweight made a dangerous difference in these open boats, especially in rough waters. Unbalancing it could make it easily flip. Still, through the buffeting waves, the crew members managed to pull the stranded men into the boat. I'm going to have the next slide if I can. Just pause. This is another painting by our good old Bjarni Jónsson showing a boat coming in. I think it's pretty accurate. Okay, so they were going to manage, they pulled the two men into their boat. They'd now overloaded their boat, its gunnels riding barely above the waterline. Any more weight would sink them. An impossible choice of who to save with no time for debate. They left the other two men behind. As others rowed to safety, those two clung desperately to the damaged boat as it began to break apart, filling steadily with water. On the rising tide, the waves now crashed over the skerry and would soon submerge it. Then they'd drown. Þuríður glanced at her crewmate Gamlason. They'd seen this tragedy too many times before. They all then looked at their captain, Jon Rich. Any rescue attempt was his responsibility. He yelled at the other skippers, "Aren't you going to give me people so I can get these men?" The other skippers looked at the sea, increasingly white with froth. The skerry, a good 1,200 treacherous, watery feet from shore. They shook their heads. Neither of the men were kin. They wouldn't take the risk. So no one did. Jon Rich shrugged and turned to his crew. He tried more than anyone else was willing to do. "It's probably not a good idea to attempt to rescue these men from the skerry," he commented. "I'm not going anywhere." Þuríður kept her eyes on the two men struggling to stay above the sea's greedy maw. "It will be known to the authorities if you don't make an attempt to get those men," she said very quietly. Jon Rich's other crew members stopped what they were doing and stared. Jon Rich jumped up and glared at Þuríður. "Then you take my job and be responsible for ship and crew," he shouted. Not that he expected her to take his angry invitation seriously. He should have known better. Þuríður considered her captain's words. She assessed the risk, the distance, her crewmates. She nodded. "I'll do it," she said to Jon Rich. "I'll guarantee the safety of the crew." She paused. "But I can't promise the same for your vessel." She looked at her crewmate. They looked from one to another. They'd go if she led them. Jon Rich gave her an infuriated wave and stormed up the bank. Þuríður and her crewmates quickly pulled the boat back into the water and set off. With Þuríður at the helm, they rowed rapidly through the spray, sliding alongside the skerry in minutes. Then, balancing the boat, they dragged the two men aboard. Þuríður ordered them to shove off fast. In an instant, they were rowing toward shore again. They'd done it, and they hadn't even damaged Jon Rich's boat. The following year, the authorities issued an award for bravery in the daring and courageous rescue of the two shipwrecked men. They awarded it to Jon Rich, who readily accepted it. So that's it. That's the section.
Oh, how little power women had at that time. But one thing that becomes apparent in that reading is how perceptive the Captain Thurther was, or the Thurther was. As you said, she could read the weather, she could read the sea. And also in the book, it becomes clear that she was a pretty good judge of people's character. And
Sure.
during her life and her life in the Stocks area, there was a robbery, and she used her perceptive talents to help kind of solve the robbery and things like that. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was, it was a little bit more complicated. I mean, yeah, that's great. Yeah, and because you've read the book. So, but so I suppose doing a slight spoiler alert here. When Thurther decides she's going to be a captain herself, or when she gets the opportunity, becomes a captain herself, Rich is really pissed. And so he basically is an enemy of hers forever afterwards, because then he has to compete with her equally on the sea, where she fishes as much, probably more, than he does. And she also becomes captain of a boat that's bigger than his. So this kind of sets it up. And this also, so that is a kind of a, throughout their life, for many years at least, this is, he is her enemy, basically, and tries to undermine her in any way he can. So this robbery that occurred, remember, all the Icelanders, I mean, except for the elite, the Icelanders were incredibly impoverished, as most of you would know. And this was not just, I mean, people stole from the merchant houses. I mean, people stole as a thing of survival. People stole all the time. But this was a robbery of lots of money of a rich guy. And that was different. So, and also the other thing is, what was interesting is farming was given a lot more prestige than fishing at this time. And fishing communities, because they couldn't be so controlled, because the farmhands, as many of you will know, maybe, the farmhands had to stay with the farmer and could only change their position once a year, and they were considered their master. They had to have permission to leave, so they were tightly controlled. Fishing people, you couldn't control as much. They made money, or fish or trade, whatever, in a slightly less controlled way. So there was a lot of dislike of fishing communities, like Stockseri and Erebaki, and they were quite populated. So all that went together, that when this robbery occurred, and it was clearly from the Stockseri Erebaki area, the authorities really, they needed to find out who it was. So nobody wanted to help them, including Thurther. So the county commissioner, as I translate Sysselmaður, went to Jan Rich, who was the deputy Repstjóri for the area. And so he went, because he got himself that position. He didn't have to pay taxes if he got himself that position. So he went to ask him to try and find who these people were. Well, Jan Rich didn't want to help either, because these people are going to be their relatives or their neighbors or somebody, But what he did say after is he said, oh, and the original documents say he thought he could roll this off on Thurther. This is what it actually says from the time. So he said, oh, the person who's known as the most observant person in this whole area is Thurther. So I suggest you go and ask her. And if she can't figure it out, then nobody will be able to. So the county commissioner, he had a big plan. So he sent a message. And the thing is, oh yes, this is another very important point. From a teenager, Thurther started wearing trousers at sea, and then she wore them on land. This is in the late 1700s. nobody else did this. She just said they were more practical. She wasn't disguising herself as a man or anything. She just said they're more practical. I mean, she liked them. So they said she wore a skirt to church, but everybody suspected she had her trousers on underneath. But she wore trousers all the time. And everybody knew this because nobody else did that. So the county commissioner knew this too. And so he sent a messenger to her Sunday afternoon when he knew she was tarring her boat, which was good practice. So she was in her trousers, tarring her boat, covered with tar. And he sent this messenger saying, you have to come right now. And she said, oh, well, I'll change, because she put on a skirt for this kind of social thing. And she changed, you know. He says, no, you have to come now. And that was planned because, so she arrived and she said, well, I'm really sorry. I shouldn't be in this entire. And he said, well, I've heard, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but we've got, they recorded exactly what happened. But he said, you know, I've heard that, as everyone else, that you go around wearing trousers. And he said, for this, you need a license. Now, research assistants, I asked the help of all sorts of historians. Some people, archivists, have looked at this. We looked back from the 1100s on. There were some laws that said you had to wear trousers or you couldn't do cross-dressing, but they're sort of in the sagas. After 1290, there was no license required. But it didn't matter. He had all the power anyway, right? So he could say whatever he wanted to. So he said, you know, so it's against the law for you to have trousers, but I will give you a license, which he never did, by the way. I will give you a license if you will help us solve this crime. So he basically blackmailed her into helping. And she promptly did, basically. But she did it in a very compassionate way. So, I mean, that's what's so interesting. There are recorded discussions about God and oaths and what she felt. And she went to visit these people, and it was really hard. It wasn't like, oh, goody at all. It was a hard thing. It was hard.
Well, thank you. And, you know, during her life, as you said, she was a sea captain, and she was also a farm leaseholder. And through that, she gained quite a bit of financial independence, which was not common for women. But then, you know, there was a series of events that took place, and she lost everything. So then she decided what she needed to do was go start over. And she went to Hafnarfjörður, and that led her to a very different life than what she had in Stokkseyri, didn't it?
Yeah. Of course, I thought all my phones were off. Sorry about that, everybody. Her losing everything had a lot to do with Jon Rich, by the way. So, you know, he was still trying. And you weren't able to move around. Hafnarfjörður would be, at the time, was considered like a different world. It was a long way from Stokkseyri, and you couldn't just move there unless you were of a certain class. And she gained a lot of enemies because of who she was and because of this robbery court case. But she also had people who adored her. She really did. And she had this opportunity to go to Hafnarfjörður because of a local guy, a young man who she'd known since he was a kid. He pointed out to her very young that he didn't like to fish. He came down to the shore and said, nah, I don't like to fish. She learned that early, but she really liked him. And his father was one of her best friends and crewmates for years and years and years, who later became a captain himself, actually. That was the Gamlason that's in that. They were very close friends. And so his son then, through a whole bunch of circumstances, actually became, worked for a merchant, a Danish merchant in Hafnarfjörður. And so when all was getting too really terrifying for Thuridur, she was still working as a captain, by the way, on the fishing season, but the rest of the season was hell. He said, come and work for me. And women did work unloading boats, for which they're theoretically paid the same as men. And they worked on the shore there in Hafnarfjörður. But she worked in the merchant house. She was working outside, which she really liked, because they thought, well, she's trustworthy, because people will want to steal. They like to steal things outside, you know, but she was trustworthy, and she had a very good head for figures, very quickly learned all this. And then they put her ahead of the alcohol too, because, well, all the guys would drink it up, and she was really good at that too. And also they put her in front because she changed. She still wore trousers, by the way, and she now wore a little tailcoat and a top hat, by the way. But she was so funny and clever that they had her at the front of the store chatting with guys as they went by. And so that was from a terrible time, she clearly learned Danish, certainly well enough to speak with people, because a lot of people did, but that was all these international people. It was just an incredibly broadening experience for her in the end. And she was still working as a captain during the season out of Thorlakshavn at this point, fishing. So, you know, she continued to fish until she was 63. You imagine that, rowing, and you're 63 out there.
Oh, and she also not only worked in the store, but she eventually became a guide.
She did indeed.
Just took on a completely different lifestyle at that point.
She saw an opportunity as a way to make money. She was really smart, this woman. She thought, oh yeah, all these Danish people, they don't know how to get around Iceland. I'm going to be an early tourist guide. And that's what she did. Delivered messages, did all this stuff, and was indomitable. There's great stories about that too that were recorded. This is what's so fun.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things that she did was really educate herself on the legal system. And really made use of it during her later life for herself and on behalf of others. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, she discovered this. Some women did use it to defend themselves. That was one thing they could. I mean, the legal system in Iceland, there was a huge amount of oppression, but women could do work in the legal system. It was pretty against women, but not nearly as much as most other places. And so you could represent yourself as a woman in the legal system. So after the robbery and everything, she had all these enemies. People started slandering her, and so this guy started slandering her. Unfortunately, we don't know the exact words. That wasn't recorded in the court case. All these court cases still exist. That's what we looked at. The original court cases. Great. And she sued him. So, and he had to pay her 3 ríkisdollars, the currency of the time. So he had to pay her. She won. So she realized from that she could do that. And so she starts out. So through her life, what's so cool is you can see her growing, her understanding of this whole thing grows. Because first she does it if people are slandering her. She's not going to stand for that. And then she does it on behalf of a woman who is being abused by her husband. And she also guides other people and tells them, look, you go and you figure this out because you're not getting your proper inheritance. So she starts advising people. And then, yeah, and in her 60s and 70s, she adopts her disabled niece, becomes her daughter, and she goes to court against the government. to get her adopted daughter the medical care she needs. I mean, by the end, she was just like, all right, we're going for it. She would say her mind to anybody, but she was just so clever. And everybody took her advice. It's quite amazing. She was just clearly an astonishing person.
Absolutely. And I've read the book and it is fascinating. And I would highly recommend everybody to read that book. And as I said, we've got links to it on the INL US website. We do have a question that has come in that says, this is fascinating. Forgive me if you answered this at the beginning, but how much time do you think you have put into researching and studying further?
A lot. No, I didn't say that, and I don't know if I can, but it's been, I mean, so I first went to Iceland in 2000, and I wasn't able to start doing, I was director of a nonprofit in Brazil, of all places, very different. And so I didn't really start, I got a grant to go there in 2009. I applied for the grant saying I was going to be looking at risk in Iceland, and get what? I got it. But then I looked at risk at sea. But so I got 2009, 2010, so I just took time off to go, but I didn't really get to start doing research in Iceland until 2013. So we're looking at 10 years ago. And I looked at the things that were really that were easily accessible for that first book, because I had such a huge breadth of, I was looking at the whole country. I looked mostly at almost entirely at published sources. And so I looked at what was easily accessible on 30 for that amount. But what I did learn through that first research is I learned quite a bit about 17th and 18th century Iceland and about the conditions and just life at that time. So that wasn't directly doing research on 30, but it certainly informed for me to be able to think about this. Then in 2017, I got a grant, National Geographic grant, to go to Stokkseyri in Eyrarbakki area. And I was supposed to be looking at the community today, and I did a bit, but really what I did is I started getting very interested in 30 because everybody's talking about it. And all the people there by then were saying, Margaret, I don't know why I'm a foreigner, but I feel very privileged. But they said, Margaret, when are you going to write it? They really liked my first book, by the way. This really made me happy. But so they were saying, okay, when are you going to write about our 30? When is it going to happen? And they, as I dedicate the book to them, and Margaret Willson, who wrote a book about, he recorded a lot of stuff about her as a kid, starting when he was a teenager, and he had no formal education at all. Amazing. And they've kept her with themselves, her knowledge alive to some extent. It was great. They have the stories that I was able to collect that weren't written down. And that will change now. I really am happy that I came on when I did, because all these people from Reykjavik are moving to Stokkseyri area because it's so expensive in Reykjavik. And so they're taking that 1 hour drive that, as many of you will know, gets terrifying in the winter, but this is supposedly a reasonable commute to Reykjavik. We will see. And so everything's going to change. The knowledge is going to you can see it happening. But I was lucky enough to be able to talk to people, and they really supported me. So 2019, and then I got a Snorri Sturluson fellowship to go to Iceland. I was very grateful for that too, and started in that working with research assistants. Then we started doing all this archive. Then we did really intense research during that. We spent months in the library, and weeks upon weeks just going through page after page of these handwritten documents. Are crumbling away in the archives, and the archivists were wonderful too. And then I had specialists help with translating, even transcribing these documents because they were sort of kind of in an archaic Icelandic Danish, and they're written. I couldn't even see where it said 30 there practically, but some historians and experts were very, very kind. It was very hard to read these, but they were invaluable. It's amazing. So, how much time? It's been several years, but it's been exciting. It's meant a lot. It's been, and I never expected to find what I found, because this is this one collection of newspaper articles that was saved, and that a guy that is Margaret Willson wrote, and I thought that was really mostly of what there was, but not at all. There's a tremendous amount more. So, yeah, it was just a discovery, a road of discovery. It was actually really exciting. The research was really fun.
It sounds like it. We have had another question come in. Can you give us a bit of an overview about Thorder's family? You mentioned a disabled niece. Did she and her family grow up on the South Coast?
Yes, they did. They were from the South Coast. So her father, they were from, well, now I will tell you, as this person who's asking this, probably asking about family, in order to write this book, I have dozens and dozens of huge genealogy charts. Because in order to figure out why lots of the things happened, why there were feuds, why people were, all that was happening, you had to understand how everybody was related. As Icelandic descent people, you will all understand this. So, and you all know that every Icelander, when you meet each other, you say, "Oh, and where are you from? Oh, Ailes from there. Oh, well, oh," and then they start finding out where their ancestors from. So, 30, her father, I'll just go to her father. But her family for generations was from the area around Erebaki, Stokeseri area. It's considered, the county was Stokeseri County. So Erebaki and Stokeseri communities are within that. So the people were living on farms in the areas, and so various farms. She grew up, she was born at Ranakot farm, and then she went to Sjell. And so her father and mother, Einar and Helga, and then she had a brother and a sister, Bjarni and Salgada. And Bjarni had 3 children, and Salgada had, a lot of them died. I think 5 lived, was that correct? And so one of them was a very disabled child. So it was that child that Thuridir adopted. Thuridir herself had one child who, this is again a spoiler alert, her child died. So
yeah, very good. Thank you. This has been fascinating, Margaret. Thank you so much. Any final comments before we wrap up this evening? Okay. Well, again, Margaret, thank you so much. Congratulations on your book. And I encourage everybody again to read it. There's so much in there that we were not able to cover this evening, and it really does do a great job describing life in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and a really incredible woman named Thurður Einarsdóttir. So thank you so much.
If I could say one thing before,
Yeah.
in closing, for those of you, it's really fun to be talking to a group of people who are Icelandic descent. And if any of you, I see you have book clubs and things, if any of you want to have it for a book club reading, I would be happy to do like a Zoom, like come and talk to the book club as on a Zoom thing. And feel free to write me any questions If you look me up in Google, I have a website, and you can write to me on that. So yeah, I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts, and yeah, it'd be really fun. In fact, I belong to a very eccentric and eclectic Icelandic book group in Seattle, of which very few are Icelandic, actually, but I joined that in the end because they asked me to come, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. It's a wonderful group. So I'm always happy to come to talk to book groups, actually. So just to say that, I think it'd be really fun, especially you guys.
Okay, perfect, perfect. Thanks again. All right, and thank you, everyone, for attending this evening. It's been an enjoyable hour, and thanks for joining us. Good night.